Before you hear another word, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever poured your soul into your work only to be overlooked, or if you've ever had to smile while someone else took credit for your expertise, I need you to hit that like button. It helps to know that what I'm about to share isn't just screaming into the void. My name is Dr. Emma Collins, and for 15 years, I was the quiet curator of a billionaire's private art collection. The key word there is was. The story I'm about to tell you is about what happens when silence is no longer an option. It's about a masterful forgery, a massive lie, and the day I decided to burn an empire to the ground with nothing but the truth. My world was one of climate-controlled silence, the gentle hum of dehumidifiers, and the sacred scent of old canvas and linseed oil. I lived in the shadows of giants, Rothko, de Kooning, Kahlo. I was their keeper, their confidante. My boss, Alistair Finch, was the collector. He didn't love art, he loved the idea of owning it. He saw masterpieces as assets, brushstrokes as talking points, and my encyclopedic knowledge as a convenient, on-demand utility, like the smart lights in his penthouse. I was Dr. Collins when he needed to impress a potential buyer, and just Emma when he wanted his coffee refilled. I tolerated it because I loved the collection. I believed my job was to protect the art, even from the man who owned it. The inciting incident. The moment the first crack appeared in the foundation of my quiet life wasn't a loud explosion. It was a hushed, reverent unveiling. Alistair had called a small, exclusive gathering in the main gallery, a cavernous white space where he performed his role as a modern-day Medici. His voice, slick with a self-congratulatory tremor, bounced off the polished concrete floors. He stood before a massive canvas, a chaotic explosion of drips and splatters in black, white, and a distinctive ochre. He called it Convergence Number 3, a newly discovered Jackson Pollock. A masterpiece, he declared, lost to the world until his brilliant eye and relentless pursuit had unearthed it. He spoke of its raw power, its kinetic energy. He pointed out the signature, half hidden in a tangle of paint, authenticating it with the unshakable confidence only a billionaire can truly possess. He'd authenticated it himself. That's what he told the reporters, the loan officers, the insurers. His word, he believed, was its own provenance. I stood at the back of the room, near the reinforced steel door to the archives, and I felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in my stomach. The painting was magnificent, a perfect storm of color and motion. It was also a complete and utter fraud. I knew, because I had the truth locked away in a climate-controlled vault, filed under a name Alistair had never bothered to learn. Julian Croft, a name whispered in the highest echelons of the art world, the name of a man who was arguably one of the greatest painters of the 20th century. His only problem? He was born 50 years too late. Julian was a forger, but calling him that felt like calling a cathedral a shed. He didn't copy, he channeled. He could inhabit an artist's soul, understand their hand, their mind, their rage, and their joy, and create something they would have made. This Pollock was his magnum opus, created in a dusty London studio in 19... Alistair wasn't just showing off a new acquisition, he was leveraging it. His tech empire, the source of his vast fortune, was hemorrhaging money. The Pollock was the collateral for a $200 million loan, a lifeline he desperately needed to keep his company from imploding. The insurance policy underwriting that loan was astronomical, and it was all contingent on one thing: the painting's authenticity. His authenticity. For a week, I lived with the lie. I watched him preen. I listened to him pontificate. I did my job. I monitored the temperature and humidity around the forgery, a silent, bitter irony that was not lost on me. Every hum of the machinery felt like a countdown. And then, last night, I made a decision. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about the truth. I went into the archives, my sanctuary, and pulled the Croft file. It contained Julian's detailed journals, photographs of the work in progress, and a chemical analysis of the pigments he used, a specific synthetic polymer in the ochre that wasn't commercially available until 1982, nearly 30 years after Pollock's death. It was an open and shut case, undeniable. I scanned every page. I compiled everything into 2 encrypted, password-protected files. The first email went to a woman named Maria Flores at the International Insurance Agency that had underwritten the loan. The subject line was simple, regarding Policy 774 Stop Chansen. Provenance verification. The second email went to a general intake address for the FBI's art crime team. The subject line was even simpler, potential fraud regarding Jackson Pollock's convergence number 3. I attached the files. I wrote no message, no explanation. The documents spoke for themselves. I hit send. The quiet click of my mouse was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a pin being pulled from a grenade. I walked out of the archives, leaving the door open behind me. The carefully controlled air of the gallery suddenly felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Alistair Finch had built his world on a lie, and I had just handed the world the truth. The moment after I hit send was an eternity of absolute silence. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. There was just a profound, hollow stillness, the kind you find at the bottom of a deep well. I had just detonated a bomb under the foundations of Alistair Finch's life, and all I could hear was the faint, indifferent hum of the gallery's HVAC system. For a second, I felt an overwhelming urge to unsend the emails, to claw the data back from the ether. The feeling wasn't born of fear for myself, but of a strange vestigial loyalty. It was the loyalty of a keeper to her charge, even a flawed one. I had spent 15 years preserving this world, and I had just become its destroyer. I walked through the silent gallery, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. I stopped in front of the fake Pollock, Convergence number 3. In the curated, low-light setting, it was hypnotic. Julian Croft had been more than a forger. He was a sorcerer. He hadn't just mimicked Pollock's technique. He had captured his ghost. The violent energy, the tormented grace, it was all there. I could see why Alistair fell for it, or more accurately, why he chose to fall for it. He needed it to be real, so it became real. His ego was the most powerful authenticator in the world. And as I stood there, the wave of panic I had been expecting finally washed over me. It wasn't a hot flush of adrenaline, but a cold, creeping dread. My stomach twisted. What had I done? Not to Alistair, he deserved what was coming, but to the collection, to the real art, the Rothkos that taught me about the divinity of color, the small, fierce Frida Kahlo self-portrait that taught me about resilience. When Alistair's empire crumbled, where would they go? Would they be seized, sold off, scattered to the four winds, vanishing into the sterile vaults of other collectors who saw them only as entries on a balance sheet? In trying to protect the integrity of art, had I just condemned the very pieces I loved? My mind spooled backwards, searching for the moment that had led me here. It wasn't a single event, but a slow, corrosive drip of 1,000 tiny humiliations. I remembered my first day, fresh out of my doctoral program, my head filled with theories on pigment degradation and post-war expressionism. I had tried to discuss the conservation needs of a Gerhard Richter with Alistair. He had patted my arm, a gesture both paternal and dismissive, and said, "I just need you to make sure they don't fade, Emma. Call me if there's a fire." He never once used my title. Dr. Collins was a name for public consumption, a prop to lend his collection academic credibility. In private, I was just Emma, the help. I remembered the time he'd hosted a gala. A visiting museum director, a formidable woman from the Tate Modern, had engaged me in a deep conversation about the provenance of a Francis Bacon triptych. We were debating the influence of Edward Muybridge's photography on Bacon's sense of motion. We were connecting, mind to mind. Alistair had glided over, a shark in a tuxedo, and smoothly interrupted. He put a hand on my shoulder and said to the director, "Isn't she a treasure? Keeps everything perfectly dusted." He then steered the conversation toward his new yacht, leaving me standing there, my expertise erased, my presence reduced to that of a high-end housekeeper. I felt a quiet heat flush up my neck, a sensation that would become a hallmark of my tenure. It wasn't about revenge. I keep telling myself that, but in the harsh light of the gallery, the distinction felt blurry. Perhaps it was about reclaiming my own name. For 15 years, he had owned the art, but I had owned its truth. I knew the hairline cracks invisible to the naked eye, the conservation reports, the quiet histories of each piece. I knew which de Kooning had once been stolen and recovered, which Warhol had a secret dedication on the back of the stretcher bars. This knowledge was my power, a power I had willingly subjugated to his service. He thought he had hired a curator. What he had really acquired was a silent, living archive, and he had never, not once, bothered to read the contents. My thoughts drifted to Julian Croft. I'd never met him. He died a few years before I was hired, but I knew him through his work and through his daughter, who had quietly passed his records on to my predecessor, a man named Robert. Robert was my mentor. He was the one who had hired me. He was a gentle, scholarly man who saw the Finch collection as a flawed but important sanctuary. He understood Alistair's vanity, but believed the art was worth the cost of managing it. I remember the day Robert retired. We were in the archives, the one place Alistair never entered. It smelled of paper and time. Robert slid a heavy leather-bound portfolio across the table. His hand trembled slightly. "Inside this," he said, "is the collection's original sin." He told me about Julian Croft, the master forger. He explained that a few of the collection's minor pieces, bought in Alistair's early, more reckless days, were Croft's. Alistair never knew, or, more likely, he never wanted to know. They were beautiful, and they filled gaps in his collection. That was enough. But the Pollock was different. Julian had considered it his life's work, the culmination of his genius. He never sold it. It was his proof to himself that he was the equal of the masters he emulated. After he died, his daughter Alara inherited his studio and his journals. She was a historian, not an artist, and she was terrified. Her father's legacy was one of criminal deception. She feared that if his forgeries were ever discovered, his name would be dragged through the mud, his genius dismissed as mere criminality. She contacted Robert, not to expose her father, but to protect him. She gave Robert the records, the journals, the photos, the pigment analysis as an insurance policy. Her condition was simple. The records were to remain sealed unless one of Julian's works was used not just for vanity, but for a grand, malicious deception. A deception that could cause real, catastrophic harm. Robert passed that trust and that portfolio on to me. He made me promise to be a guardian, not an executioner. "Use this only if the wolf is truly at the door, Emma," he'd said. "Not to punish the shepherd, but to save the flock." For years, the portfolio sat in the vault, a sleeping dragon. I had a choice. I could have exposed the minor forgeries. I could have created a scandal for Alistair years ago, but I honored my promise to Robert. I was a guardian, but Alistair's move with the Pollock, that changed the calculus. He wasn't just hanging a beautiful fake on his wall, he was committing a colossal act of fraud. He was using Julian's ghost to swindle hundreds of millions of dollars, which would in turn be used to prop up a failing business, likely deceiving shareholders and employees in the process. The wolf wasn't just at the door, it was in the dining room, wearing the host's tuxedo and drinking his wine. My promise to Robert wasn't just to protect the collection, but to honor the spirit of Alara Croft's request. This was the moment she and Robert had foreseen. And that brought me to Clara, Alara's daughter, Julian Croft's granddaughter. I'd met her a few times over the years. She was a brilliant young art historian, sharp and fiercely protective of her family's legacy. Unlike her mother, Clara didn't want to hide her grandfather's work. She wanted to recontextualize it. She believed he was a master artist whose circumstances had forced him into the shadows. She dreamed of a day when a Croft could be exhibited under his own name, celebrated for its technical mastery, not condemned for its deception. After Alistair's grand unveiling of the Pollock, I had made a call. It was a risk, but one I had to take. I found Clara teaching art history at a university in upstate New York. I told her what Alistair was doing. Her voice on the phone was tight with a cold fury I recognized. "He's not just using my grandfather's work," she'd said. "He's perverting it. He's turning his genius into a cheap criminal tool." That was my catalyst. It wasn't just my own indignation anymore. It was the righteous anger of 2 generations of Croft women, the keepers of a secret legacy. Clara gave me her blessing. "Do it, Emma," she'd said. "It's time. Let the world see the truth, not just about the lie, but about the artist who was brilliant enough to create it. Her words severed the last thread of my misplaced loyalty. My duty was no longer to Alistair Finch, or even to the physical collection. My duty was to the truth of the art, the truth of the artist, and the truth of my own worth. So now, standing in the silence of the gallery, my brief panic subsided, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just an executioner. I was a liberator. I was about to liberate the truth of Julian Croft's genius from the prison of Alistair's lie. I was about to liberate the real masterpieces in this collection from a man who used them as furniture. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to liberate Dr. Emma Collins from the shadow of just Emma. The breakdown was over. The resolve had set in. The consequences would be a storm. But I had just found my eye wall. Let it come. I turned my back on the fake Pollock and walked out of the gallery, the curated artificial silence feeling, for the first time, like the calm before a cleansing rain. The plan wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion. It was a seed I hadn't even realized I'd planted years ago, a dormant contingency that had been quietly growing in the dark, nourished by a steady diet of disrespect and my own meticulous nature. You don't spend 15 years managing a billionaire's chaos without developing a profound sense of foresight. Alistair called it paranoia. I called it proper preparation. My entire professional life was a series of contingencies. I had off-site, triple-redundant backups of the entire collection's digital archive. I had emergency protocols for fires, floods, and power failures. It only made sense that I would, subconsciously or not, have a protocol for a catastrophic failure of integrity. The core of the plan was, of course, the Croft portfolio. But it wasn't enough to just have the documents. A vengeful, disgruntled employee could forge documents too. Alistair's lawyers would tear me apart, paint me as a liar trying to blackmail her wealthy employer. I knew I needed more than proof. I needed an unassailable narrative, a story so compelling and corroborated that it would be instantly believed over the frantic denials of a cornered billionaire. This is where my alliance with Clara Croft became the fulcrum of the entire operation. After that first call, Clara and I began to speak daily. We were two women from different generations, bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. She wasn't just an ally, she was my hidden leverage. She possessed the one thing I didn't, the human story behind the forgery. While I had the cold, hard science, the pigment analysis, the spectrography reports I'd secretly commissioned years ago on the minor Croft pieces for conservation purposes, Clara had the soul. She had her grandfather's letters. She had photographs of him in his studio, not as a shadowy criminal, but as a father and a grandfather. She had her mother's written testimony, a notarized account of the day she had first entrusted the records to my predecessor, Robert. Together, we constructed the counter-narrative. It was a work of curation, as detailed and precise as any museum exhibit I had ever mounted. We organized the material not for a courtroom, but for the court of public opinion, which we knew would move much faster and be far more brutal. We created a timeline. We had photos of the painting leaning against a brick wall in his dusty London studio, the light catching the wet paint. Julian dies. His daughter Alara discovers the painting and the journals. 2002, a fixer for a then-unknown collector named Alistair Finch acquires the painting from a cash-strapped distant relative of Alara's, who sold it without her knowledge or consent, presenting it as a studio work from the Pollock era. The story was murky, but the check cleared. This was Alistair's original sin, willful blindness. He wanted a Pollock, and he didn't ask too many questions when a lost one miraculously appeared for a bargain price. Our narrative meticulously detailed how the painting was not a plant, not a tool of entrapment, but a masterpiece that Alistair had essentially stolen, laundered through his own ignorance, and was now using to commit fraud. It reframed Julian Croft, not as a criminal, but as an artist whose legacy was being desecrated. This was critical. It meant our attack wasn't just an accusation of fraud. It was a story of artistic justice. My secret weapon wasn't just the file I'd emailed. It was a second, far more comprehensive dossier I had prepared for Clara. This dossier contained my own signed, notarized affidavit, detailing every instance of Alistair's dismissiveness, every time he'd cut corners on conservation for a real piece to afford a new toy, every conversation where he demonstrated a profound and willful ignorance of the very treasures he owned. It was a 15-year chronicle of negligence and ego. I included copies of my ignored memos, my unanswered emails about climate control fluctuations, my pleas for better security. It painted a picture of a man who was not a custodian of art, but a dragon sitting on a pile of gold he couldn't appreciate. The plan was for me to be the first domino. My anonymous tip to the FBI and the insurer would start the official process, the slow, grinding gears of investigation. But Clara was the checkmate. She would remain silent, my ace in the hole. The moment Alistair or his lawyers tried to discredit me, the moment they painted me as a fantasist or a blackmailer, Clara would go public, not with an angry rant, but with a calm, scholarly, and devastatingly sympathetic interview with a major art journal, or perhaps a publication like the New York Times. She would present her grandfather's story, complete with photos, letters, and her mother's testimony. She would corroborate my evidence and add a layer of emotional, historical weight that would be impossible to dismiss. They could attack me, a disgruntled employee. But could they attack a grieving, fiercely intelligent granddaughter fighting to protect her family's name? We were building a fortress of credibility. The foresight went beyond the dossier. For the past 5 years, I had maintained my own private cloud storage, completely separate from the Finch network. On it, I kept a shadow archive. It contained my personal notes, conservation logs, and, most importantly, a detailed record of every interaction I'd had with other collectors, museum directors, and auction house specialists. Alistair saw these people as his contacts. He was wrong. They were my colleagues. I was the one who spoke their language. I was the one who had collaborated with them on loans, on research, on authentications. My professional reputation, built quietly in the background, was pristine. Alistair's name opened the door, but my expertise was what kept the relationship alive. This network of quiet professional respect was another of my hidden assets. They trusted Dr. Collins. They merely tolerated Alistair Finch. I knew that when the story broke, Alistair's first instinct would be to control the narrative, to use his wealth and power to crush the source. My plan was designed to be decentralized. The official investigation would come from one direction. The media narrative, wielded by Clara, would come from another. And the subtle, lethal shift in the art world's opinion would come from a third. It was a three-front war, and Alistair wouldn't even see two of them coming. My final act of preparation was intensely personal. It was an inventory not of art, but of my own life. I paid off my car. I put 6 months of living expenses into a separate checking account. I scanned my diplomas, my letters of recommendation from my university professors, and the glowing pre-Alistair performance reviews from my time at a small university museum. I created a digital go-bag of my own professional identity, ensuring that no matter what happened, I could prove who I was and what I knew, independent of Finch Enterprises. It was a quiet declaration of independence, an administrative emancipation. This wasn't about revenge, it was about strategy. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was a cold, calculated demolition. I had watched Alistair operate for 15 years. He believed money could solve any problem. He believed power was a blunt instrument. He had no understanding of nuance, of reputation, of the kind of power that is earned, not bought. My plan was designed to attack him on the terrain he didn't even know existed. He was a king in a castle, and I wasn't laying siege to the walls. I was poisoning the well. I was talking to the cartographers who drew his maps. I was rewriting the history of his kingdom. The night I sent the emails, I called Clara one last time. "Are you ready?" I asked her. Her voice was steady, clear as a bell. She said, "My grandfather waited his whole life for people to see his work for what it was. It's an honor to help make that happen." We didn't speak of Alistair. We didn't speak of the money or the chaos. We spoke of her grandfather, the quiet genius in the dusty London studio. Our alliance was forged, not in a shared hatred of Alistair Finch, but in a shared love for Julian Croft. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was a force Alistair could not comprehend and could not defeat. The hidden leverage wasn't just a file of evidence, it was the entire, unimpeachable truth, and it was ready to be brought into the light. The first move wasn't mine to make. It was the world's reaction to the seeds I had planted. For 3 days after I sent the emails, nothing happened. An unnerving, profound silence. I went to work. I performed my duties with a placid, almost zen-like calm. I checked the humidity levels. I answered Alistair's trivial emails about the lighting for an upcoming dinner party. I walked past the fraudulent Pollock, our silent co-conspirator, and felt a strange kinship with it. We were both waiting. This quiet period was the most nerve-wracking part of the entire ordeal. Did the emails get lost in a spam filter? Were they sitting in a digital slush pile? Ignored? Had I overestimated the impact of my evidence? The thought was terrifying. Not that I would be caught, but that I wouldn't be. That the world would be so indifferent to such a monumental lie that my grand gesture would simply fizzle out. On the morning of the 4th day, the silence broke. I was in the archive cataloging a new set of prints when my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a text from my one true ally inside the Finch empire, a junior curator named Ben. Ben was young, sharp, and deeply disillusioned. I'd mentored him, and he repaid me with a fierce, quiet loyalty. The text was short, a coded message we'd established long ago for when things went sideways. It just said, "The Eagles have landed." It meant someone from a 3-letter agency was in the building. My heart didn't leap. It settled. A quiet, grim satisfaction washed over me. It has begun. I stayed in the archives, my sanctuary. I knew Alistair would not think of me. In his mind, I was part of the furniture. The problem would be an external attack, a rival, a mistake by the bankers. He would never suspect the betrayal came from within his own climate-controlled walls. An hour later, Ben texted again. 2 of them, FBI, art crime team, asked for Alistair. They're in his office now. The door is closed. Another text a few minutes later. They have a file with them, a printed out file, my file. I could picture it perfectly. Alistair leaning back in his ostentatious leather chair, all feigned nonchalance and performative cooperation. He would see them as bureaucrats, as gnats to be swatted away. He would assume it was a formality, some red tape from the loan company. He would offer them coffee. He would ooze charm. Ben's texts painted a picture of Alistair's slow-motion detonation. The first sign of trouble was the length of the meeting. It stretched past the 1-hour mark. Then 2. Alistair's 11 a.m. conference call was cancelled by his frantic assistant. Then his lunch. Ben, whose workspace was just outside the executive suite, reported that the tone of voice coming from behind the closed door had shifted. The low, confident rumble of Alistair's voice had been replaced by a higher, more strained tenor. The agents' voices remained calm, flat, and methodical. That was the sound of a predator that knows its prey is already trapped. Around noon, the second front of my silent war opened up. An email landed in my inbox. It was from Maria Flores, the senior risk assessor at the insurance agency. It was brief and formal. Dr. Collins, thank you for your correspondence. We are treating the information you provided with the utmost seriousness. As a precautionary measure, we have placed a temporary hold on the final disbursement of funds related to Policy 774 JP, pending an independent verification of the collateral. We may require your expert assistance in this matter. Please let us know a secure time and method to contact you. The language was sterile, corporate, but the meaning was a cannonball through the hull of Alistair's ship. Temporary hold, independent verification. These were the words that gave billionaires nightmares. The $200 million lifeline was frozen. The blood supply had been cut off. I replied from my personal email on my phone, suggesting a call later that evening. I kept my tone detached, professional, the concerned expert. Meanwhile, Ben's reports from the front line grew more frantic. Alistair's voice was now clearly audible, sharp and angry. Then, silence. A few minutes later, the door to his office opened. The 2 FBI agents walked out, their faces impassive. They did not look at anyone. They simply left. Alistair did not escort them out. His assistant, a young woman who was perpetually terrified, peeked into his office, then quickly backed out, her face pale. Ben texted, "He's just sitting at his desk, staring at the painting." The Pollock wasn't in his office. He was staring at a high-resolution digital print he had framed on his wall. The real one was in the main gallery, but in that moment, the symbol was all that mattered. The panic was beginning to set in. The denial was cracking. Alistair spent the rest of the afternoon in his office, a black hole of rage and fear. He made a flurry of calls. Ben could hear snippets. First to his lawyers, his voice a furious bark. Then to the bank, his tone shifting to one of strained reassurance, the forced bonhomie of a man trying to plug a dam with his finger. The bankers, undoubtedly already alerted by the insurers, would have been polite, evasive, and utterly unhelpful. The gears of finance are ruthless. Once doubt is introduced, the machine grinds to a halt. This was the moment I had anticipated, the moment Alistair, cornered and confused, would start lashing out. But his rage was misdirected. He was looking for a mole in his company, a rival in the market, a traitor at the bank. The one person whose name would never cross his mind was the quiet, invisible woman in the archives. I was a non-entity, a ghost in his machine. My invisibility, once a source of quiet frustration, had become my greatest weapon. I left work at my usual time. I walked past the executive suite. The lights were still on in Alistair's office. I didn't look in. I didn't need to. I could feel the waves of his panic radiating out from under the door. As I walked out into the cool evening air, I felt a sense of profound clarity. The takeover wasn't about seizing power in the conventional sense. I didn't want his job. I didn't want his company. The silent takeover was about transferring the power of the narrative. For 15 years, he had been the sole author of his own story, a myth of genius and success. Today, the story had a new author, me. That evening, I spoke with Maria Flores from the insurance company. Her voice was crisp, professional, but I could hear an undercurrent of gratitude. People in her line of work hate being made to look like fools. I had saved her firm from a $200 million mistake. I calmly and methodically walked her through the Croft file, explaining the science, the history, the provenance. I didn't offer opinions or accusations. I just stated facts. I told her about Julian Croft, the artist, and his wish to never have his work used for a major deception. I mentioned almost as an aside that his granddaughter, a respected art historian, was aware of the situation and had the original family records. I was offering them a second, unassailable source. I was giving them their entire case on a silver platter. By the time I hung up the phone, I knew the hold on the loan was no longer temporary. It was permanent. The silent takeover was complete. The initial move had been made. The antagonist was in a state of pure, unadulterated panic, and he still had no idea who had fired the shot. He was fighting shadows, swinging at ghosts, and I was at home, drinking a cup of tea, watching the city lights come on. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the beautiful, undeniable elegance of a well-executed plan. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in watching a man unravel from a safe distance. The power shift wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a cascade failure, a series of dominoes I had set up, now toppling one after another in perfect, ruinous succession. The news of the frozen loan didn't stay quiet for long. In Alistair's world of high finance, information like that moves at the speed of light, transmitted through whispers, encrypted chats, and nervous calls between bankers. The arteries of capital that had fed his empire for decades began to constrict. The first visible sign of the client exodus came in the form of an email from the director of a major Swiss museum. For months, we had been negotiating the loan of our most prized possession, not the fake Pollock, but a stunning, deeply personal Georgia O'Keeffe, red canna. The director was a longtime colleague of mine, a man who respected my judgment implicitly. His email was addressed to me, but he copied Alistair, a subtle but clear choice of primary recipient. It was polite, full of regretful phrases, unforeseen scheduling conflicts, revisiting our exhibition calendar, but the message was clear. They were backing out. They were distancing themselves from the stench of scandal. Alistair, of course, saw this as a personal betrayal. According to Ben, he spent an hour shouting into his phone at the poor Swiss director, a tactic that only served to solidify the man's decision. Alistair didn't understand that in the art world, reputation is the only currency that truly matters, and his was now radioactive. That was just the beginning. A prominent collector who had pledged 2 major pieces for a charity auction, Alistair was chairing quietly withdrew them. A famous artist who was scheduled to have dinner with Alistair to discuss a potential commission cancelled, citing a sudden illness. These weren't direct attacks, they were strategic retreats. The herd was moving away from the wounded animal, leaving it isolated on the plain. The true masterstroke, however, was yet to come. It was time to deploy Clara. Alistair's lawyers had begun to float a narrative to the few friendly journalists they had left. They were painting me as the villain, a disgruntled, low-level employee, perhaps in league with a corporate rival who had fabricated evidence out of spite. They were trying to muddy the waters, to create enough doubt to buy themselves time. It was a predictable, clumsy move, and it was exactly what I had been waiting for. I gave Clara the signal. She didn't go to a tabloid. She didn't post on social media. She gave an exclusive interview to Art and Authenticity, the most respected and academically rigorous journal in the field. The interview was a work of art in itself. Clara was brilliant. She didn't rage or accuse. She spoke with a quiet, scholarly grief. She told the story of her grandfather, the misunderstood genius. She showed the interviewer his letters, his private sketches. She presented his art not as a crime, but as a tragedy. Then, with surgical precision, she unveiled the truth about Convergence Number 3. She explained how Alistair Finch had not discovered a lost masterpiece, but had acquired a private family heirloom through dubious means, and was now using her grandfather's soul as collateral for a bank loan. The article, titled "The Curator's Ghost," landed like a bomb. It was accompanied by high-resolution photographs of Julian Croft's journals, the chemical analysis of the ochre paint, and most devastatingly, a photo from 1987 of a much younger Clara, sitting on her grandfather's lap in his studio, with the unmistakable Pollock canvas visible in the background. The story was irrefutable. It was human. It made Alistair look not just like a fraud, but like a grave robber. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The art world, which had been whispering, was now shouting. The narrative was no longer about a financial dispute. It was about the desecration of an artist's legacy. My name was mentioned only once, as the courageous curator who brought the truth to light. Alistair's clumsy attempt to slander me had backfired spectacularly, casting me as a hero and him as a villain. This is when he made his last, desperate counter. He called me. It was late at night. I almost didn't answer. But I was curious. I wanted to hear it. His voice was a strange cocktail of feigned warmth and barely concealed panic. "Emma," he began, as if we were old friends. I let the silence hang in the air. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," he said. "A campaign against me. You and we've always been a team. We can fix this." He offered me everything. A new title, director of the entire Finch collection, a salary that was triple my current one, a seat on the board of his arts foundation. He was trying to buy my silence, my complicity. He still believed that everyone had a price. I listened patiently as he laid out his pathetic offer. When he was finally done, I said one thing. My voice was calm, devoid of any emotion. "Is that all, Alistair?" The use of his first name, without the fear and deference he was used to, seemed to stun him more than anything else. He stammered something about loyalty, about the years we'd worked together. I replied, "You authenticated the painting yourself, Alistair. That was your choice. I'm afraid the consequences are yours to authenticate as well." Then I hung up. I didn't block his number. I wanted him to know I was choosing not to engage. The power shift was complete. He had nothing left to offer me that I wanted. His money was tainted, his titles were hollow, and his world was on fire. I, on the other hand, had the one thing he had lost forever, a good name. The final confrontation wasn't what you might expect. There was no dramatic boardroom showdown, no tearful confession. That would have been his world, his language, all noise and bluster. My victory was meant to be quiet, precise, and absolute. A week after the Art and Authenticity article was published, I received a formal request from the board of Finch Enterprises. They were conducting an internal investigation and requested my presence at the main gallery. They wanted to speak with me, alone. I agreed. I chose the time. Dusk. I chose the location, in front of Convergence number 3. When I arrived, the gallery was empty, except for 3 people. 2 board members, grim-faced men in dark suits, and Alistair. The painting loomed behind them, no longer a symbol of triumph, but a monument to a spectacular lie. It looked different now, almost ashamed, its chaotic energy curdled by the deception it had been forced to participate in. Alistair looked smaller. The bespoke suit hung on him differently, as if his body had shrunk. His face was sallow, his usual arrogant posture replaced by a tense, brittle stillness. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept in a week. He tried to control the room, but one of the board members, an older man with cold, clear eyes, held up a hand to silence him. "Dr. Collins," the board member said, his voice respectful. He used my title. It was the first time anyone in that circle had. "We owe you an apology and a debt of gratitude." He explained that the evidence I had provided, corroborated by Clara Croft's testimony, had allowed them to uncover the full extent of Alistair's financial desperation and the fraudulent means he had used to secure the loan. He had lied not just to the bank, but to them. He had put the entire company at risk to save his own skin. I didn't say anything. I just listened. I let the silence do the work. Alistair stood there, his jaw tight, forced to listen to his own indictment. The board member continued, explaining that Alistair would be stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. He would be forced to sell his controlling shares to cover the company's losses and the inevitable fines. He was being surgically, ruthlessly excised from the empire he had built. Then, for the first time, Alistair looked directly at me. His eyes were burning with a desperate, hateful confusion. "Why?" he whispered. The voice was thin, reedy. "After everything I did for you," it was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. He genuinely believed he had been a benevolent patron. He saw my salary as a gift, not a payment for my expertise. He saw my loyalty as his due. In his worldview, he had done everything for me, and I had betrayed him for nothing. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us until I was just a few feet away. I looked from his tired face to the magnificent forgery hanging on the wall. I thought of all the years of quiet humiliation, of being rendered invisible, of my love for the real art he had used as mere decoration. I thought of Robert's trust and Clara's courage. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. I finally spoke. My voice was low, not a whisper, but a clear, precise tone that cut through the quiet gallery. "You once told me my job was to make sure the paintings didn't fade," I said. My eyes locked on his. I was just doing my job. This one, it was fading. It was making all the real ones fade. So I restored the collection to its original state. That's all. I saw the flicker of comprehension in his eyes, the final, crushing understanding that this wasn't an attack he could comprehend. It wasn't about money or power in a way he understood. I had judged him not by his bank balance, but by my own code, the code of a curator, a keeper of the truth. And by that measure, he was worthless. I turned to the board members. I nodded once, a gesture of finality. Then I walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see his defeat. I could feel it. It was a tangible presence in the room, as real as the fake Pollock on the wall. As I walked out of the gallery and into the evening air, I felt the weight of the last 15 years lift from my shoulders. The air had never smelled so clean. The new reality had set in. He was a ghost in a gallery I had exorcised. The collection was, for the moment, safe. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, free. In the end, it was never about the money, the power, or even the revenge. If you've followed my story this far, you understand that. It was about a simple, fundamental principle. Truth has its own weight, its own gravity. You can defy it for a while, with enough bluster and ego, but eventually it will pull you back to earth. Alistair Finch tried to cheat the gravity of the art world, and it crushed him. The company was restructured. The board, in a move of surprising wisdom, appointed a new CEO with a background in crisis management, not tech or art. My old ally Ben was promoted to interim curator, a decision I quietly endorsed. He would protect the collection, the real collection. The fake Pollock, Convergence number 3, became a legend. It was at the center of a massive legal battle between the insurance company, the bank, and what was left of Alistair's estate. But something beautiful happened. Thanks to the global attention from the scandal, Clara Croft was able to achieve her dream. A prominent gallery in New York is now planning a major retrospective of her grandfather's work. It's called The Master's Hand, the art of Julian Croft. They're even in negotiations to have Convergence number 3 as the centerpiece, exhibited under his own name, celebrated for its genius, its story finally told correctly. Julian Croft, the forger, is finally being seen as the master he always was. His legacy is not one of crime, but of brilliance. That, more than anything, feels like true vindication. As for me, I didn't take a new job right away. I took some time. I traveled. I visited small museums, the ones run on passion instead of profit. I reconnected with the reason I fell in love with art in the first place, its ability to tell a human story without saying a word. A few months ago, the FBI's art crime team reached out. They offered me a position as a special consultant. They needed someone who understood the soul of the art world, not just its price tags. Someone who knew how to spot a lie, not just on a canvas, but in the heart of a collector. I accepted. Now I protect not just one collection, but all of them. My name, Dr. Emma Collins, is on a government ID badge. It's a different kind of quiet, a different kind of archive, but the mission is the same, to protect the truth. I'm telling you this story not to brag, and not to wallow in the past. I'm telling you this because I know I am not alone. I know that right now there are thousands of you out there, in every field, in every office, who are the invisible architects of your workplace. You are the one who holds it all together. You are the one with the institutional knowledge, the quiet competence, the expertise that your superiors take for granted. You are the firewall, the foundation, the keeper of the secrets. And you are, more often than not, overlooked and underestimated. Let my story be a lesson. Your value is not determined by the title on your business card or the attention you receive from people who don't have the capacity to appreciate you. Your value is inherent. It's in your skill, your integrity, your knowledge. And that is a power that no one can take from you. You don't have to burn down an empire to prove it, but you must never, ever let anyone else convince you that your contribution is small. It isn't. You are the reason things work. You are the quiet hum in the background that keeps the lights on. Don't wait for a crisis to recognize your own power. Start building your own archives. Keep a record of your accomplishments. Cultivate your networks based on mutual respect, not just hierarchy. Know your worth, so that if the day ever comes when you have to make a stand, you are standing on solid ground. Your story is your own. You are its curator. Make sure you tell it well. Thank you for listening. It means the world to know that there's a community of people out there who get it. If my story resonated with you, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this video with anyone you know who might be feeling invisible at their job. And leave a comment below. Tell me about a time you had to be the quiet keeper of the truth. I read them all, and they remind me that none of us are ever truly alone.